Welcome. Thank you for joining the U.S. Data Management Project Management Practice Best Series Practice Webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's session. Gary Meek, USDM's Project Management Practice Lead, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, direction for post-webinar collaboration, and our discussion topic, Agile Development and Validation for the Life Sciences. Can they coexist? We're proud to have Gary Meek presenting today. He is the Global Practice Lead for USDM's Project Management team, and Gary has 25 years in program and project management experience, with more than 10 years in the life science domain. Gary has presented on project and change management to multiple forums and is a recognized leader in his field. He's a subject matter expert in program and project leadership, organizational change, strategic planning, and building teamwork. He's worked with small, medium, and large life science firms worldwide and recently led cross-functional global project teams, including major organizational transformations and integrations. U.S. Data Management is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality and regulatory compliance, professional service solutions. USDM's practice areas include IT and virtualization, quality and auditing, enterprise content management, enterprise resource planning, product lifecycle management, manufacturing automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, business intelligence, laboratory systems and equipment, governance, risk, and compliance, and of course, our project management practice. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients. We've offered hands-on experience assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're the market leader for validation accelerator packs. The content will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board, which you'll find on the lower left of your screen. Or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn and post any questions or comments there. Of course, if your question is of a confidential nature, we're happy to address that directly offline. Thank you for taking the time to join us, and with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Gary.
Good morning. Yes, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us this morning. Should be a pretty good topic. We have a lot of slides to get through, so I'm going to cover them at more of a high level. If you're looking for more detailed information, please let us know, and we'll be happy to provide the additional details. As Becky said, I lead the Global Project Management practice, so I'm really a project management person. I'm not a validation expert by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm not a development expert. But what I'm here to do today is really walk you through somewhat of a case study of a project that I managed that was using Agile Development, and it was in a validated environment. So it was a pretty interesting project, and I'll give you some of the details as we go forward. So really today, just wanted to take you through an overview, give you a brief overview of the Agile Development methodology, just so for the folks that aren't familiar with Agile and how it works, to give you that overview. Have a little bit of a case study as far as what we did, how we did things, what approach we used, how we worked with the quality folks on both the IT and business side, and give you some information around that. Talk to you a little bit about the lessons learned, summarizing things we may have done differently, summarizing the approach, things that came out of it, did it work, what was successful, what wasn't. And then we'll close and give you an opportunity to ask whatever questions you might have. So with that, we'll move forward. So the purpose of today is really to talk about a real-world example of this project. This is not something that came out of a book, but it's something that we really did. We lived. It was very, very challenging. And to give you some of the lessons learned regarding the approach that we took, certainly there's more than one way to do this, but this is the approach that we took, and give you some of the success that came out of that. So one of the things is, why are we talking about this? Why is it relevant to the way we're doing things? And as you probably know, the Agile development methodology is gaining acceptance across many organizations. It's done in many different ways. The term Agile is used in many different contexts, but it's really a way, it's gaining ground because it's a way for the IT folks and the business folks to interact very closely together and to gain the business feedback into the process and actually see everything as the application is being developed. And it's a very quick way to get working systems in production in very short order, so that it's providing business value to the organization in a much shorter term than has done in the past. So as a life sciences organization, we need to figure out, if we're going to start using this Agile development methodology, how do we approach this from a validation perspective? As far as the Agile development methodology, it's called a bunch of different names: Scrum, Agile, iterative development. It's essentially the same. It's really meant to provide a team infrastructure where they're focused on developing quality software and getting it in production in short order, which is somewhat contrary to the normal process of developing software, validating it, and getting it into production. It's been around for a while, goes back as far as the 70s. It's really probably in the last 10 years or so is where it's really started to gain some traction, and is really starting to be used in many of the larger organizations across the globe. So again, they have this manifesto, and you can go out on the internet and do the search, and you can see the manifesto that came out of the group that wrote it as far as Agile development. And I'll just go over kind of the four highlights, right? It's individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over this contract negotiation stage, which would be, the contract negotiation is the project charter, if you will. This is what we will build for you, and if it doesn't work, the traditional method is we come up with this charter, or we come up with this contract, we develop this, we promise to deliver this, this is what the scope is, and this is what we'll deliver. If it doesn't work, we'll write a change order and we'll figure it out later, but this is what we're going to deliver, and we're going to stick to that. The Agile methodology is really more of a collaborative environment where the business and the developers essentially are sitting together figuring out what this is going to be when it's done, and reviewing working or prototype software as opposed to following some documentation somewhere. So again, this is kind of against the normal grain of how we would do validation. And then responding to change over following a plan. Again, it's more the concept of the software is being presented to the business, we're reviewing it, they like this, they didn't like this, they want us to change this. And it's not necessarily following the standard project plan, if you will. It's more responding to that, fixing that, getting it to the point where the business is satisfied with it. So it's as you can see, trying to use this methodology with a validation environment is very challenging. These are just some more of the principles, and I put all this data in here just as if you want some additional details, we'll be happy to provide you the details, but we have a number of slides, so I'm not going to go into all of these in great detail. So this is the standard waterfall methodology that we all know and love. It's, we're going to do requirements, we're going to sign off on those, then we're going to do the design, and this is really building up to that control and that contractual agreement between the business who defines the requirements and the folks who are actually delivering those requirements. Again, if it's outside of that scope, then we just don't build it. We put it in a future phase, or we do a change order to actually make the change and change the timeline, change the budget, and all the rest of those things. So that's the standard model that we've all followed for a number of years, and this is really more how the Agile methodology works. So we have an initial idea or initial concept. We understand from a high level what the problem is, what the opportunity is, and then we start to go about developing various documentation, if you will, but it's really not the standard requirements document. It's more of, what we would consider user stories, and then from there we would develop something along the lines of a prototype or storyboards, and we would iterate through that until something comes out of that the business sees as providing value, and then we take that and we push that on into production. So you can see as we're going through this circle, the requirements and the design and everything associated with what we would normally do waterfall-wise up front is constantly iterating along with the changes in the development. And so it becomes very challenging to validate these types of development projects. So the project really was a global system, users 5,000 or so across the globe, taking multiple systems and putting them into one. We had a development team that was very, very familiar with the Agile methodology, that had never gone through a validation before. And then we had a validation team and a quality group that was obviously very familiar with validating software development, but had never really been involved in an Agile development project. So, so the idea was we're going to put together a way to do this. And to be honest, when they first started pitching this project to me, I thought that there was obviously something had gone astray somewhere, and somebody didn't get the language right. But so the idea was we're going to come up with a way to validate this, develop it, and use the teams that were in place to develop this application for the global implementation, and that we were going to come up with 2 deployments of this validated system, one local to the U.S. and one a more global rollout to the rest of the world. So it was a very, very challenging exercise. To be honest, I don't know that this would work in every life science organization. There are many places that I've worked where the quality group is so risk averse that they would never even consider an approach like this. But there are many that I believe that would consider it, and as I said, it works. There are some challenges, but it definitely works. So we needed to come up with a new way of doing this. We still had a series of SOPs that we had to follow related to computer system validation. We still had all of obviously the requirements that were out there as far as the application goes. We needed to learn to leverage more of the documentation that comes out of the Agile development So it's the storyboards, it's the user stories, the storyboards meaning kind of mock-up screen designs, all the designs, and then the testing documentation. Obviously, we had to use the standard formatting and required content. We had multiple environments for the iterations. And then, just many, many other things that had to be considered to really deploy this application. The other part of this is we had a timeline that was set for us. That timeline was not really negotiable. So it was something where we had to hit the timeline, we had to hit the budget, we knew at a high level what the requirements were, and that was about it. So we committed to it. We had to deliver a validated quality product to the business in a very, very short order. And when I'm talking about short order, I'm talking about something along the lines of 9 months from the time that we started doing the initial planning to the time of the first deployment. So that's 9 months to develop the application, to put in all the environments, to put in the infrastructure, to do all of the testing and do all of the validation activities, training, and deployment in 9 months. So that was a very, very short timeline, and I'm happy to say that we actually made that. So, so the challenges to this approach, obviously you're probably sitting there and you know that within your organization there will be a number of challenges in doing this. And when I first got pitched the idea of managing this project, my first question was, who's the QA person and what are they like to work with? Because if you've got a very risk-averse QA group, the challenges just go astronomical to you. So we had a lot of people who weren't necessarily on board with this approach. There were questions about using the Agile Development methodology at all from the more conservative steering team members. Sanity was questioned at all levels. This came from almost every direction, including myself in the beginning of, what are we trying to do and what have we gotten ourselves into. It's very difficult to control scope when you're using an Agile methodology, because the whole point of one of the, as we talked about before, one of the principles of this Agile methodology is that you continue to build until the business is happy with something that can provide business value. It was a huge cultural change for the organization. This was multiple organizations coming together. It was a huge cultural change, so we had all of that we had to deal with at the same time that we're trying everything else. The development team, as I said, had no knowledge of validation. They wanted to literally just, reach under a box underneath their desk and make changes to the infrastructure in the database. The validation team was not experienced in the Agile methodology, and so they became the wall, if you will, keeping things from going to production, or at least that was the perception. So it was a trying to pull the team together was another big challenge, and then the increased scrutiny, because the QA team was not necessarily on board with our approach, and so they were looking at things very, very closely, consistently. So it was a huge challenge. Obviously, you can see that. So the way that we went about doing this was we created this strategy, and this strategy was really all about managing risk. So what was the real risk? So we did an assessment of basically everything that we did to determine what is the level of risk associated with this approach, with this application, and the risk to the business. So we documented all of that. We put it in our validation plan. We did the best we could to closely control the scope for each of these iterations. It was, if there was the biggest challenge, if you will, that was the biggest challenge. and it was a matter of negotiation with the project team and with the business team to control that scope and make sure that we were able to deliver in the time that we were going to deliver. And we literally were looking at things like how critical is this that you have this functionality? Can you do your job without this functionality? So that we could continue to meet the timeline and at the same time deliver the product that the business needed to do their job. So it was a fun experience. By the time the project deployed, I got called a lot of very interesting things, but the one thing that came out of that was that apparently I always say no about everything. So it was fun. So as we starting to talk about summarizing and the lessons learned, if you will, again, the biggest thing is our approach was we essentially held all of the documents open, if you will. So as we were going through these iterations, as we were going through this Agile development, the requirements document stayed open. We used the system and what was built in the system to define what the requirements were. So until we were ready to finalize an iteration and put that first deployment into production, we still had open requirements. And so literally right before we started to do the validation testing, the requirements document had still not been signed. And so we waited until the end. We signed the requirements document, we signed the design document, and we signed all of the test cases essentially at the same time, within a couple of days of each other. That was our approach. Again, that made it very challenging to control scope because we didn't know what the requirements were. The requirements were what was built into the system, and so it was very challenging to keep up with the documentation and very challenging to keep up with making sure that we were going to be able to deliver in a timely manner. So some of the things that could help, right, are making sure that coming out of any testing that the bugs and any enhancements that are requested are prioritized by the business to make sure that when we were only going to deliver what absolutely needed to be delivered in that first deployment. The idea was to get this new application in the hands of the users in production so that they were able to better able to understand how it was going to work and better able to give us solid feedback on exactly how it should be changed and how it should work in the future. Coding standards and common coding practices, one of the things that really needed to be done that was not done in the fashion that it should have been is very structured code reviews. We did not, again, faced with timelines, we did not do the level of detail that we should have done for those coding standards, following those. And then, you have to make sure that all of your documentation coming out of the Agile methodology is consistent and that it's constantly kept up to date. And again, that's a chore when you're dealing with a very tight timeline and a lot of documents that these folks were not used to doing. They were used to writing a system, working with the business, writing a system, getting it in place, agreeing with what it should do, agreeing with what it should look like, and that was pretty much the extent of the documentation. So it was a big cultural change to get them to document anything. Moving right along. So is it feasible? Sure, it is feasible. It worked. We got the system in production For the most part, the users were happy. It's never a case where all users are happy. We really did, by the time we were probably halfway into the project, we had the development folks and the validation folks sitting in the same room working together so that the validation people heard the discussions, heard the requirements. They really became one very cohesive team, which it certainly wasn't like that in the beginning. Everyone had the common goal. We're going to deliver the best quality that we can possibly deliver to the business in the time frame that they've asked us to deliver it. It would have helped us if we had some electronic system for approving the documentation, but we didn't at the time. So everything was on paper, and we were getting paper approvals. The PM is a very critical role in this because they're the ones that are primarily responsible for maintaining some semblance of scope, maintaining some semblance of freezing the code so that the validation folks have time to actually do the job on the back end. And then, if those things change, ideally the date would change, but in our case, the date was not movable. It was the immovable object. So literally we would negotiate scope 3 weeks before we were going to move to validation. So it was a balancing act. So the project management role in this case is very, very critical. You really need a business analyst to help with those requirements. Keeping the upper management in this project and any project is critical to being able to have the backing that you need to really be able to deliver this kind of an approach. And then, the bottom line was it works, and it worked well. It certainly was not without hiccups. I always, when people ask me how we did it, I always say it was purely brute force because this was the first time that we had done anything like this. There were a lot of adjustments made during the course of the project. There were a number of times where we all sat in a room and said, okay, this came up now. How are we going to handle this? How are we going to address this? And it was, myself and the validation lead and the development lead and the tech lead and the person responsible on the QA side really sitting down and saying, okay, what makes sense? How do we minimize the risk? And how do we still deliver in the timeline and deliver the quality that the business folks expect? So, the bottom line is it did work. We got it to production. We hit our timeline. We hit our budget. And the business was reasonably happy. There was a lot of brute force and a lot of hours put in to get there. And so with that, that's what I have for the presentation, and I would be more than happy to do the best I can to answer your question.
Thank you so much, Gary. We appreciate the solid information around your experience there. We will open the floor to questions now, and while you're typing those in, I would remind you that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on our website, which is, of course, usdatamanagement.com. It's usually up within an hour or so following the presentation. And we will go to our first question, which is from Ed. Has a couple of questions in order, but we'll do them one at a time. His first question is, who wrote the validation documents, and was it the people on the project team or additional resource assigned to the project?
So we had a team of validation people that were responsible for writing the validation documentation. We had a val lead, and across the multiple projects we had 5 what I would call validation engineers. They were responsible for writing the documentation, executing the test cases, and obviously they weren't executing the ones that they wrote, but they were they were really working as a team to deliver all of this. And we used mostly external resources, external contractors to do the bulk, almost all of this project. This was in addition to all the other work that was being done internally.
Thank you, Gary. Next question from Ed is, how did you handle the preparation of training material? Often the final system is not known until the final release.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, we contracted out the development of the training materials. We had one of the training folks sitting with us as the development was going on. And again, it was the same type of thing. Literally right before deployment, the application was still changing, and the training materials were still changing. So probably up to a month before we went live, we were still adjusting all of the training materials. We got them complete. We got them approved. This was online training, instructor-led training, user handbooks. It was all of that was literally completed and approved in a very short period of time, and then the next week rolled out for the actual training.
Very good. Okay, the last question from Ed here is, was there a Scrum Master in addition to the PM? Was the separation of responsibilities, or what was the separation of responsibilities?
Right, and so we did not have a Scrum Master. This was really, we created a series of sprints. Towards the end, we started doing more of the daily stand-ups, but we did not really have anyone from the Scrum Master category. It was really myself and the team kind of driving these activities as much as we could.
Thank you, Gary. Let's see, question from Martin. Was there a transition of user stories to discrete requirements?
Yes. So we took the user stories that came out of that really came out of the BA and the development team. The development team was used to doing their own kind of user stories, working with the users. So between the developers and the users, they developed the user stories, and then that was passed on to the validation team for the creation of the requirements documents. But there was no real traceability of those things.
I see. All right, the next question is from Sanjay, asking, can we use Agile in a migration project?
Use Agile in a migration project. So I've seen that approach used where they do the migration in an iterative type approach, and I'm assuming that that's what we're talking about, where we batch up a series of records and migrate those in an iterative fashion. And there's actually tools out there that use that approach. I personally have never done anything that way as far as migrations go.
All righty. Let's see, we have a question from Abhishek. What was the level of regression testing which was performed on the final release candidate prior to the going live? How was the scope of regression testing determined?
Yeah, so we did, we had an SQA group that did the SQA testing as it went along for the iterations. And then we did a full regression testing for the final release candidate that we pushed to the validation team and to production. We had a document, was an executable functional spec. It was something in the neighborhood of 800 pages that we executed as the final regression test, if you will, right before we moved from the QA environment to the validation environment. And then we did the standard OQ and PQ in the validation environment, which was somewhat to a lesser extent than what the executable functional spec was.
Thank you, Gary. Question from Ali. Can we work remotely in an Agile project?
Yes, you can. We had part of our development team was in Europe. Part of the development team was in Northern California. You can definitely do that. It does add challenges. My recommendation is where you can co-locate the development team and the validation team. That seems to be what works best, so that the validation team can stay apprised of everything going on, and you're really not providing it in a documentation manner, but more the validation team and the development team take the approach that they're kind of in this together. But you can definitely do it with a remote development team.
Thank you, Gary. Looks like we have just time for one more question. We'll take the one from Fred. It says, if you had to do it all over again, what would you change?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The hardest thing really was trying to control the scope, and I don't think anyone really realized the level of challenge that would present. I think if I were to do it all over again, I would try to do more iterative development and moving things into production in smaller chunks, as opposed to doing the iterative development in a testing capacity and then moving the entire chunk over to production. I would try to figure out what business value we could add in a smaller chunk, and then do that over time.
Very good, very good. Gary, if you don't mind, we did have one additional question that looks like it deserves an answer here from Ali. When can we start documenting the requirements and test cases if the design and the requirements keep changing?
Yeah, and so that's exactly what we did. We located the validation folks that were writing the requirements and the test cases with the development team. So as the system changed, they changed they kept up with that in the documentation. So as soon as the system was frozen, if you will, the requirements document was complete, the design document was complete, the test cases were complete, and then it was just a matter of starting to get signatures.
Got it. All right. Thank you, Gary. We do appreciate you taking the time to present for us today, and we appreciate everyone taking the time to join us, as a matter of fact. We do invite you all to join the discussion forum on LinkedIn. We welcome your insight and feedback, and even suggestions for future topics. Help us to know what pain points you're having out there, what issues in compliance are coming up that we could help you to work through. We're glad to share information and also share our capabilities in those lines. If you appreciated the presentation today, please let us know by clicking the like button on the USDM LinkedIn group page, or even better, put a comment out there. We'll take you just a moment, and it would be very important to us. In 2012, this is an important indicator that our management team is looking at and using as a basis for determining whether to continue to fund the complementary series. So let us know that it's working for you, and also let us know your suggestions. We appreciate you taking the time to join us, and on behalf of the U.S. Data Management team, we do appreciate the opportunity to team with you towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.